This lesson is about sin, shame, fear, and control. When we're talking about the roots of religious addiction, these words here on the screen were spoken by a woman in a treatment center where this guy named Father Leo led a spirituality group. She said, "I hate God, and I also love God. When I hear you talk about God being loving and forgiving and nurturing and involved in my life, it bears no resemblance to what I was taught as a child. The first words I remember as a child were, 'God is going to get you.' And it went downhill from there. God was always to be feared, an angry God, a God who punished you and your family with sickness if you broke the rules, a God who was against laughter and fun. Father Leo, a part of me loves God, but a bigger part of me hates God." And this is tragic. But this woman's love-hate relationship with God is not uncommon. A lot of people struggle with grievous issues related to their religious experience, from lay people to clergy, fundamentalists, mainstream Christians, Orthodox Jews, atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Muslims, New Age disciples, and even 12-step junkies. They all share a common experience. In the name of God, they've been made to feel fear, guilt, shame, and anger. In the name of God, they have emotionally, physically, or sexually abused themselves or others. In the name of God, they've brought themselves or others to the edge of financial ruin. In the name of God, they've judged and condemned themselves or others as either worthless or inherently bad. And as a result, their unhealthy beliefs about themselves and God poison their lives. They use religion as a means to acquire power and control, especially to gain money or sex, or even both. Their only means of gaining self-respect or self-control is to lock themselves into these rigid, intolerant perfectionism, harshly judgmental of other people who don't follow their rules. And they use God, religion, or even their beliefs not to liberate themselves spiritually, but to escape emotional pain. Eventually, however, their relationships sicken, their self-esteem withers and dies. Desperate to feel better, they then fall prey to any substance, person, or belief that promises relief. And this behavior, it creates an insurmountable barrier to authentic spirituality. And even worse, to a healthy creative relationship with that inner power that I call God. And I find this tragic and unacceptable. In a lot of treatment centers, you can clearly see how shame fuels addiction. Shame comes from dysfunctional religious beliefs, dysfunctional religious messages about sin, about sexuality, and about God as an angry judge or a cosmic fixer have created these toxic beliefs from which people have tried to escape by means of addictive practices. Then we have these TV evangelist scandals, from financial embezzlements by Jim and Tammy Baker at PTL, Jimmy Swaggart's sexual escapades, Oral Roberts' outright blackmail of his flock and demanding millions of dollars or else God was going to call him home, to Creflo Dollar's daughter having him arrested for choking her, and not to mention the many accusations and convictions against pastors for sexual abuse. Fascination often turns to horror, and amusement bursts into outrage when the media reports of infighting that's revealed the magnitude of the tragedy of religious addiction and abuse. These supposed men of God have betrayed people's trust. They've taken people's sacred belief in God and they made a mockery of it. And yet, many of those who had been abused or betrayed and bankrupted, they never seemed to question what was happening. They just remained faithful. How could that be? Why? How could they not see the abuse? What we read and hear in the news reports concerning the TV evangelist scandals echoes what is often heard in treatment centers and 12-step meetings. God will keep me from drinking again. Jesus helped me get thin. I don't need the 12 steps. I just have to follow the teachings in the Bible. in the Course in Miracles, in the Talmud. In these dogmatic statements, I see black and white thinking. I see refusal to think, doubt, or question. I see obsessive thinking. In short, I see addiction. Taking away the scripture quoting, the praying, the sacrifice, the rigid devotion to rules, and looking solely at the attitudes and behaviors behind them reveals the same kind of attitudes and behavioral patterns long identified as those of alcoholics and addicts, and of codependents. I see a family of God as dysfunctional as any family of an alcoholic that I've ever met. And it's staggering to realize that a lot of the children of God have grown into adult children of, kind of sounds like adult children of alcoholics, but adult children of what? A dysfunctional God? Well, we know that's not possible, but the messages that they have received about God are dysfunctional, or at least they create dysfunction. Whatever they experienced in the name of God molded their belief about themselves and about God. Here's the source of the religious shame, that insurmountable wall that separates so many people from a loving and creative relationship with God. The more we examine the idea of a dysfunctional family of God, the clearer it becomes. In the excessive tithing and giving, I see the same compulsive urgency I've seen in gamblers. In the dedication to church ritual, I see the sex addict's need for ritualizing. In the glazed, hypnotic look of a woman quoting scripture at me, I see the drug stare of an addict after a fix. In the staunch loyalty of the baker's followers, I see the same denial I've seen in an alcoholic spouse. The TV evangelist scandals now appear in a different light. We start looking first at the churches involved in the scandals, and then at all the religious and belief systems for the sources and symptoms of the dysfunctional messages. It is typical that adult children of dysfunction, any type of dysfunction, nearly always believe a negative, unhealthy message about themselves. Rarely do they ask if something's wrong with the message. They assume there's something wrong with them. And each time I dig to find the reason for this curious dynamic, I strike a bedrock of unhealthy religious beliefs and messages from which seem to spring all kinds of abusive and addictive behaviors. I believe in a loving, caring God who delights in a creative relationship with human beings, the human race. How could this relationship, which I view as special and precious, have become so grievously distorted and dysfunctional? And more important, can it be healed? What we are seeing is an increasingly addictive and addicted society desperately searching for a fix. In the patterns of how religion has shaped society, we find that religious messages which teach that we are inherently bad and powerless and weak, and we must therefore look to God to make us good and strong, these are at the core of this addictive behavior. A short look at how this unhealthy cycle developed is going to help us to understand how the messages we received about God can lead to dysfunctional behavior, and how these messages laid the foundation for much of the shame and the guilt that so deeply affects so many people in our society today. So, Erich Fromm, in his book To Have or to Be, describes religion as not necessarily having to do with the concept of God, but as any group shared system of thought and action that offers the individual a frame of orientation and an object of devotion. And as Fromm suggests, religions and belief systems seem to be divided into two camps. Those that believe that human nature is essentially good, and they focus on our innate dignity, and then there's those that maintain that humans are inherently evil and base. This corresponds with the definition of religion as being essentially a set of man-made principles about God focusing on a teacher or a prophet, in contrast to spirituality, which is the process of becoming a positive and creative person. Moreover, this definition is going to allow us to look not only at organized religion, but also at any group or belief system that either generates dysfunction or is used dysfunctionally. And when those beliefs inspire us to develop our creative potential, whether spiritually, as individuals, or culturally as a society, those beliefs move us forward and may be seen as healthy. And when they limit or paralyze us, or they're used by ourselves or others to oppress and victimize us, they're going to be regarded as unhealthy. I believe that many of the religious messages that we've received, not only in the Judeo-Christian faith, but also in most of the world's religions, have been twisted, misinterpreted, or misunderstood to the extent that far from bringing us closer to God or Allah or Buddha or the Great Spirit, that they have created a spiritual void, this vast chasm that separates us from God. Our desperate search for something to fill that void, bridge the chasm, fix the problem, and that leads us to addictive, compulsive behavior. We will explore some of those reasons and sources for these misunderstandings and show how they create the dysfunctional beliefs and behaviors that do lead to addiction. Many Christians perpetually struggle to reconcile the concepts of sin and pain and suffering with the concept of a loving and forgiving God. And it's hard to imagine someone who loves us allowing us to endure pain and tribulation. We must have done something wrong to deserve punishment, only we're not sure what we did. And if we could find out, we could fix it and be loved again. The messages and teachings concerning the concept of the original sin offer the explanation that we're just born bad, and only by following God's rules can we overcome this inherent blight. The negative effects of self-esteem and spirituality created by this concept and how it contributes to religious addiction and abuse are going to warrant some examination. Dysfunction and its effects are the disease of religious addiction and abuse. But this isn't the first time anyone has pointed out the negative effects that traditional religious teachings have had on our spiritual growth. In this century alone, I am but one of many people who have observed that something is wrong with the interpretations of the message that's given by organized religion and the resulting dysfunctional messages that have created dysfunction within us. William James in 1902 wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, and he quoted a letter written by the eminent Unitarian minister Edward Everett Hale. And he said, "A child who is early taught that he is God's child, that he may live and move and have his being in God, and that has, therefore, infinite strength at hand for the conquering of any difficulty, will take life more easily, and probably will make more of it than one who is told that he's born a child of wrath and wholly incapable of good." So Hale is pointing out the effect that messages of guilt and shame, they have something to do with how we cope with life. James quoted this particular passage in a chapter called The Religion of Healthy Mindedness, in which he's noting a growing movement away from a focus on hellfire and damnation toward a more positive, affirming theology. We now have whole congregations whose preachers, far from magnifying our consciousness of sin, seem devoted rather to making little of it. They ignore or even deny eternal punishment and insist on the dignity rather than the depravity of man. This search for the dignity rather than the depravity of people is reflected in much of the pivotal religious movements and theological writings of this century. And increasingly, there's an awareness that the idea that we're born bad or evil or inadequate has seriously had a negative effect on our self-esteem and our relationships with God and our fellow humans. And with that awareness is a sense of how these negative messages form the core of all addictions, to which we now add religious addiction. In the early 1920s, Pierre Teilhard saw life as just pure energy expressed in both physical and spiritual domains, at once interconnected yet independent. According to his theory, our physical and spiritual sides are two halves of a whole, and we're incomplete if we deny one or exalt one side over the other. The human task, as he saw it, was to build a bridge between our physical and spiritual sides so that the two energies could be mutually enlivened. Teilhard explained sin, or evil as he preferred to call it, as diminishments that come from both inside and outside us to hinder our ability to unite with God. The diminishments from within, for example, might be our own human weaknesses, our attitudes and attributes. Diminishments from without are such phenomena as poverty and natural disasters and disease, or the effects of someone else's behaviors or illnesses. He believed that anything obstructing or sapping our physical and spiritual energies keeps us from the source of all energy, which is God. One can see in Teilhard's philosophy some of the seeds of what was later to become integral parts of the AA 12-step program. In his description of sin as diminishments that keep us from God, we can see the AA concept of defects of character, which perpetuate addictive behavior. And my understanding of spirituality as encompassing the mental, physical, and emotional aspects of humanity owes much to Teilhard's explanation of how our physical and spiritual sides unite to create a whole. Writers from William James and all the way to Teilhard in the early part of the century to Matthew Fox and M. Scott Peck and John Bradshaw today, they all chronicle and explore a growing awareness of that spiritual emptiness that's felt by a lot of people, the alienation and the shame produced by the negative messages that religion often gives. In The Psychology of Religion, psychologist Wayne Oates examines the effect of the idea of sin and what it has on self-esteem and our relationship with God. Describing sin, he says that the realistic acts of wrongdoing of a person, as the person perceives right and wrong, they do produce a sense of guilt. And when that guilt is felt to be in relation to God, the guilt is consecrated or concentrated into a sense of sin. The end result of this sense of sin, Oates says, is alienation from other humans and God. He says that sin as alienation from God and man is the composite and end result meaning of sin. Idolatry alienates one from God and those persons and or things that are put in God's place. Shrinking back from participating with God and man in the demands of growth in personal and corporate life alienates one's relationship to self and others and God. So we have the idea that sin means breaking the rules or violating a code of ethics, which produces guilt and ultimately stands in the way of our relationship with God and others. This corresponds to Teilhard's concept of sin as diminishments, which weaken our ties to God. It also applies to William James' description of religion as either the search for truth or a means to avoid error. And recently, we've seen renewed attraction to metaphysics and the rise of these New Age philosophies, the issues of women's rights and their place in the church, that have led theologists like Matthew Fox to seek a feminine and nature-oriented theology, in which God is as much mother as father. And this movement away from the traditional religion reflects a new kind of search for an explanation of the existence of pain and suffering, one that's not based on the premise that humans are inherently evil and deserve to suffer. And Fox makes a natural bracket at the close of the 12th century to Teilhard. Both are priests, and both seek to blend the spiritual and physical worlds. And Fox, too, sees humankind as an expression of spiritual energy drawn from and back to its source. So, like Teilhard, Fox has been forbidden by the Vatican to teach his theology of creation spirituality, which promotes the idea of original blessing as a counter to original sin. And in an interview in Psychology Today, Fox said, "I also object to original sin as the starting point of religion because of the tremendous psychic damage it's done. People are already terribly vulnerable to self-doubt and guilt, especially members of minority groups, women, blacks, Native Americans, homosexuals. The whole ideology of original sin increases one's alienation and feeds the masochistic energies in the culture, the sense that one is not worthy. If you start with the notion that you were born a blotch on existence, you're never going to be empowered to do something about the brokenness of life. In creation spirituality, we begin with the idea that each of us is born a unique expression of divinity, an image of God, teaching our children this is the only way to build the pride and security our culture needs so desperately. So now we've come full circle, from Edward Everett Hale in the 1890s to Matthew Fox in the 1990s, saying the same thing that I'm talking about. A belief system that tells us we are depraved from the outset, victimizes us, and limits our spiritual growth individually and as a species. Moreover, in explaining why he refuses to leave the church, Fox echoes my beliefs. Even if the church is a dysfunctional family, it's my family, and I would rather see it healed than to abandon it. In these theologies and philosophies, we can see reflected the same themes: rejection of the shame-based messages traditionally taught by the major religions because of the spiritual damage these messages inflict, and thus an abandonment of God as traditionally represented. Alongside this, we see the search for personal dignity and self-respect that, when it arises out of a lack of a higher power, leaves this spiritual hunger and yearning of restlessness. St. Augustine said, "We are restless till we rest in God." And it is in this restlessness and yearning that tells us that we are in need of that power in our lives. The negative teachings and dogmas that often cloak God also hide God from us and kind of propel us into an unhealthy behavior. And once we can separate God from the dysfunctional messages about him, God comes alive, ever inviting us to become positive, creative people. Clearly, the idea of original sin, of being born inherently weak and inadequate, has had a negative effect on us as individuals and as a society. I'm often asked why God would tell us that if it weren't true, right? So I suggest that perhaps God never said it. And I recognize that I'm treading on some of the core beliefs of those who depend on a literal fundamentalist interpretation of the scriptures. And I would never deny anybody that choice of interpretation of the scriptures of any religion or belief system. But certain changes occurred in Christianity and in the way that the Bible evolved that leave room for many interpretations. My objection has never been to fundamentalism. Rather, it is to the insistence that I or anyone else is eternally damned for believing in a different interpretation. Religious addiction is built on absolute, unquestioning, uncritical acceptance of a set of teachings. On this foundation, abuses are committed in the name of God. The key ingredients are fear, shame, power, and control. And no matter what the religion or the belief system, fear and shame are manipulated by those wanting power and control. Those abuses extend even to changing or twisting the basic scriptures or writings. And I believe Christianity is no exception. As a Christian, and thus familiar with that faith, I'm going to use it as an example, but the dynamics that I explore apply to any religion or belief system that is being used abusively. A literal, absolute, and dogmatic interpretation of Scripture opens the door to dysfunctional religious messages and behaviors. While I accept that, the historical Jesus, I also recognize that a lot of the teachings about him, the dogma and doctrine central to Christianity, came from people who were interpreting what the messages in the Gospels meant to them. And these interpretations are often the source of today's dysfunctional messages. In contrast, a healthy religiosity permits us to distinguish the religious teachings from the spiritual message. An unhealthy, rigid religiosity limits Jesus, the church, and us, because it only serves to separate and alienate us from God. How did we get the idea that God told us that we were bad? How did that process put us on the road to all addictions, especially religious addiction and abuse? Matthew Fox has observed that there were 19 billion years of history and God's creative activity before human beings appeared on the scene and invented sin. Ever since Genesis was first handed down, great theological debates have raged over the issue of sin. What is it? Are you born with it? Or do you acquire it along the way? What do you do about it after you've got it? The theories and doctrines concerning sin are many and they're varied, but some predominant ideas about it are common to both literal and fundamentalist theologies. Sin results in alienation from God and others, and this has its roots in the biblical story of Adam and Eve. In the Judeo-Christian context, most theologians agree that the concept of sin was born in the story of Adam and Eve's disobedience to God's instructions. Like Wayne Oates, Eric Fromm says the consequence of that disobedience was alienation from God and from ourselves. The symbolism in the story of the fall implies that prior to Eve eating the fruit, Adam and Eve were unified. They were part of each other. And this is symbolized by Eve having been created from Adam's rib. They had no awareness of each other as separate beings. The curse of Eden, if we want to call it that, was that once Adam and Eve saw themselves as separate, then mistrust and doubt and division enters the world. And from that time forth, we would always be struggling to be reunited with ourselves and with each other and with God. So we have the basis for the fear that underlies so much dysfunction. If we're bad, then we will be rejected and abandoned, and always struggling to get back into and remain in God's good graces. In turn, this leads to a desperate need to be perfect, to do things right so that we won't be punished. This is the avoidance of error that William James refers to when defining unhealthy religiosity. It led to a blind following of the rules, which abrogates all choice. But who makes those rules? Who decides what's bad and punishable? The literal fundamentalist explanation is that God made the rules and God metes out the punishment. And if that's so, then God must be very busy to be so many places at once. But the question opens the door to an examination of how this fear of God is used to control and often to abuse. Eric Fromm, in The Dogma of Christ, gives a very carefully documented overview of the role religion plays in any society and how that is reflected in the transformations wrought in Christianity in its early days. These changes, he's saying, provide much of the basis for the underlying guilt and shame that permeate Christian doctrine. Explaining the role that religion plays in any society, Fromm says that is often used to compensate for the deprivations created either by nature or by the ruling class, and then it also serves as a mean for social control. He says that religion provides a fantasy means of making up for those deprivations, a mental or emotional image in which desires are fulfilled. And he says that religion or fantasy satisfactions have the double function which is characteristic of every narcotic. They act as both a painkiller and as a deterrent to active change of reality. So to sum it up, religion has a threefold function. For all mankind, it's a consolation for the privations that are exacted by life. And then for the great majority of men, it's an encouragement to accept their class situation. And for the dominant majority, relief from guilt caused by the suffering of those they oppress.